Nice to finally meet you in person.
That's right, nice to finally meet you.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
I'll give you some signs for minutes missing, just so we keep it in time. But you know how that goes.
It's good, yeah.
Same for me, please.
I mean, people were doing that to me yesterday. Yeah, I'm just gonna keep talking.
Yeah, no, please do. That would be great.
Well, I have 8:31, so we'll start. Welcome, everyone. Saturday morning, 8:30. So it's a statement. My name is Bruno Alcalde. I teach at University of South Carolina, and we have a very interesting session about form today. And first presenter is Andrew Conklin. He's an assistant professor and program director of composition and music theory at University of the Pacific. Andrew makes and studies music that engages with American vernacular idioms and contemporary classical practices. And as a bassist, he earned a 2017 Grammy nomination for Best Bluegrass Recording. He lost. So let's welcome Andrew Conklin.
When students leave our class at the end of this semester, or leave our degree program, or leave whatever course of study they're involved in, or leave this week's unit of study, what will they be like? What will they think like? How will they confront new problems that they encounter?
Envision a student who will enroll in a course you'll teach next term. Once they successfully complete the course, how will they have changed? What are your aspirational goals for them? And now I'll add this part. Imagine this student 1 or 5 or 10 years later still applying the knowledge, skills, and attitudes they learned in your class. Imagine you're having a conversation with this student, and the student is so excited to share their new favorite song with you, and they launch into an impassioned and articulate description of all the song's fascinating musical features. As you stand there, silently overjoyed to be witnessing this example of music theory in practice, pause for another moment to re-envision this student. What do they sound like as they describe the music? What sorts of words are they using? Does it matter? What features of the music are they listening to? What musical patterns do they notice? What tools can they use to demonstrate these patterns? Okay, so if we all have a picture of the student, I hope. So let's just call the student green. This student is green, meet green, they're happy, they've taken your class, you know, they know how to listen to music. This is green, and now this is red. Red has not yet taken your course, a little sad because of that, and therefore has not yet acquired the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that green has. Red does not yet have the tools that green does for listening and conversing about music. Now, meet a third student. Let's just call him Paul. This is Paul. In a moment, we'll hear Paul talk about music. And as you're listening to Paul talk about music, I'll ask you just to try to situate Paul in somewhere in the continuum between red and green. So is Paul closer to red, or is Paul closer to green? And just, this is a rough instrument, of course, but If you'll just humor me and either go to polev.com, Conklin 2022, or the QR code should work. And so I'll leave this up. Don't worry if you haven't gotten it yet, it's still up here. And let's just listen to Paul talk for a bit about music.
And like a lot of old tunes had just a set chord pattern, because that's the great thing. Once you start trying to find out chord patterns, you really suss what people are doing, you know, what musicians are doing. And they really, it's, you know, it's like... Like old tunes, you know, they have just a certain way of going, and they hardly ever vary from it. So you still basically only want 3, 4. You know, okay, so that's getting more complicated than the 3, but it's still only...
Yeah, still used the same way, presumably.
Yeah, and from there, you know, like, there's no... Unless you stop yourself, there's no stopping yourself.
Yeah.
I will confess that my attention occasionally waned over the course of Peter Jackson's 8-hour documentary on the Beatles' Let It Be sessions. But I was riveted as I watched Paul McCartney talk music theory to this starstruck young member of the film crew. This was one of the moments I really could not forget. And I could not help but watch this clip through the lens of a teacher doing what teachers do all the time, which is observing student behaviors. So I thought to myself, well, what behaviors am I observing here in McCartney's brief teaching session? I was watching someone analyze existing songs by drawing connections to basic underlying harmonic patterns and demonstrating this by playing common chord progressions from memory with confidence and musicality. I was also seeing someone evaluate approaches to chord construction, comparing the relatively complex 4-note 7th chord structures to the relatively straightforward 3-note triadic language. I was witnessing someone create original work by synthesizing foundational concepts. It's worth noting how these skills align with the highest learning levels in Bloom's taxonomy of learning. These are the learning levels we usually associate with course learning outcomes, which themselves help us measure the knowledge, skills, and attitudes we hope our students will attain. Oh, good, now we get to look at the results. I hope we have enough people here to get a very interesting, oh, you didn't, oh, okay. This is very interesting. I did not know what to expect, and we're really kind of across the board, and maybe we can talk about this during the Q&A. Very evenly distributed. All right, so here are my thoughts. So it's definitely apparent to me that McCartney, he's likely not had much opportunity or reason to practice verbally explaining this music that he clearly knows so well. And therefore, he sometimes is grasping at terminology to describe, for instance, just like a 1-6-2-5 chord progression, you know. And perhaps this is one way that McCartney could be viewed as sort of more to the red side of the spectrum. But to me, in the most important ways, he meets or exceeds my aspirations for a student. There he goes, like green. He approaches the music with curiosity. He identifies underlying patterns, regardless of what he calls them, he identifies underlying patterns and demonstrates how they can be manipulated and elaborated. And he is able to readily translate this information into practice at the keyboard and singing. So these observations make me think of 2 points that have emerged repeatedly in my conversations with alumni and faculty at my institution. I often ask these colleagues to tell me how we as theory faculty can better prepare their students, our students, for life after graduation. In one of my most memorable exchanges, a colleague in the piano department related how some students come in with ease in harmonic analysis and key ID. Others struggle throughout their time. It's pretty much a matter of needing them to have structures at their fingertips when we work on sight reading or memorizing. So if I had to make one request, it would be to see students have greater immediacy at seeing structures. And just as an aside here, I notice the emphasis on seeing. There's a lot of sort of visual emphasis. I sort of see this, and to me, I translate it as a better immediacy, greater immediacy at perhaps recognizing structures, so that there can be a sort of oral component to that as well. Another interesting conversation I had with a recent graduate of our music education program, who said that he felt his theory and musicianship courses could have better prepared him and his fellow students to listen critically to a range of musical styles and to verbally articulate what they hear. He felt like the theory and musicianship courses didn't give him the tools to do that. As I watch McCartney, I am reminded of the evidence-based reality that has come up several times in this conference, that students are more intrinsically motivated to learn new concepts when they encounter them in relevant and relatable contexts. McCartney is genuinely interested in this music. This is music he knows and loves. He is overflowing with things to say and show about it. I hope we can all relate to this feeling. I suspect it's the reason that many of us are here, are in this field. And I think for many of us, our most satisfying moments in the classroom happen when our students get to experience this same feeling. If it seems these transcendent moments are too rare, perhaps it is because we too rarely allow students to choose the music. I'm not saying we should always do that, but maybe we should do it more. Student agency is central to so many of our community's efforts to enhance student engagement and increase the quality of student learning. Rebecca Jamian's contextual listening exercises exemplify such an approach. Patricia Burt adopts a broad view of music fundamentals, making them more immediately relevant to her students and the music they encounter daily. And these, I should say, are just two of the countless inventive teaching approaches that have emerged from the music theory pedagogy community, and we've heard about many new ones in this conference. So all of these approaches were on my mind midway through the fall 2021 semester in my Musicianship 1 class. I had made several significant changes to the course since the previous fall. We had been online the previous year, we were returning to in-person instruction, and in general, I was happy with how this redesigned version of the course was going. However, I was not satisfied with how our listening activities were going. Like Bert, I had decided to prioritize form in my first semester course, and I was interested in translating Bert's approach from a music theory context to an oral skills context. So I began the semester by asking my students to listen to musical excerpts and diagram the phrase structure. I really wanted to start with phrase and form. Then I asked them to listen for meter and to situate the lyrics of the song. Most of these were songs with lyrics in the context of the metrical structure. Soon, I was asking them to pay attention to the important pitches in the melody and bass parts. Borrowing from Jamian, I asked my students to describe a moment in the recording they found engaging or interesting, to describe it and also to situate that moment in their diagram. They also had to justify in writing their labeling of the phrases, of the excerpt's phrase structure. Why did they call it AA prime or AB, So I couldn't imagine why my students wouldn't want to complete all of these steps for each in-class listening exercise. We were listening to great music. I agonized over choosing the perfect musical examples for these activities, starting with my dream playlist of parallel periods, which featured some of my favorite songs by Withers, Cook, Teal and Weiss by way of Louis Armstrong, Molina, Mozart. What could go wrong? Come on. While my approach did have some merits, it became clear to me that I had made two key miscalculations. The why. I knew why I was asking my students to make these diagrams over and over again. Making the diagrams gave them practice listening to music with attention and intention, to know what to listen for and why. When I envision a student who has completed my course, this skill is always central. My students, many of my students, were not making this connection, however, between the diagramming process and the underlying listening skills the process was meant to teach. To many of them, the diagrams were an end rather than a means to an end. And of course they felt this way. I was grading them on the diagrams, not what they did with the diagrams. The second miscalculation concerned the what. What were we listening to? We were listening to music I loved, that I picked. The listening activities were relevant to me. Because I cared about the music, I was intrinsically motivated to complete these assignments. Despite my best intentions, I had created a teacher-centered activity. I needed to make it student-centered. So my solution to this was the guided tour, what I called the guided tour, and its premise was simple. I met with each student at the end of the semester for a one-on-one conversation. I asked them to do the following to prepare for their appointment. Pick an excerpt from a piece of your choice, so like a verse-chorus pair, or maybe an A-A prime phrase pair, once through an A-B form, depending on the song. But some kind of representative chunk of a piece, not the whole thing, but enough. I asked them to prepare to use your voice to demonstrate, to explain and demonstrate the many fascinating structural aspects of the piece using tools such as we were using solfege and takadimi that semester and conducting. And I told them to be ready to discuss with me the form and phrase structure, the melody, including being ready to sing it on solfege, and the rhythm and meter, being ready to perform any of it on conducting and takadimi or counting. Like they could do counting as well. Now, I also asked them to make a diagram of the recorded excerpt, which both the student and I could use to consult with during our conversation, so sort of like a reference. The format and the design of the diagram was left up to the student. Importantly, the purpose of the diagram was now clearly baked into the assessment. The diagram was a reference tool that would help the student organize and recall their thinking about the music so that they were prepared to have a detailed and nuanced conversation about it. The diagrams were wonderfully varied, though many of them I noticed combined some degree of standard notation with graphic representations of form and phrase structure, as well as things like solfege and takadimi. And that, to me, suggested that perhaps these diagrams could be functioning for students as organically emerging sites of confluence between musical iconography, nomenclature, and sound. And I'm using those terms from Cynthia Gonzalez's 2019 article in Engaging Students. So the guided tour was a component of each student's final summative appointment with me. I assessed it using a simple 10-point rubric. The rubric helped me answer these questions. Did the student address a breadth of musical parameters, not only melody, for instance? Were the student's explanations and demonstrations largely accurate? Was the student fluent in their use of tools such as solfege and takadimi in conducting? Was the student thorough in their analysis of the excerpt? And did the student simply submit their diagram in advance of the appointment so that we could both use it as a reference? And I will just say this experience was a joy. A joy. I had 35 of these conversations, and each was totally engaging and packed with learning opportunities, and my only complaint is that they were too short. I only allowed 5 minutes for them. I wish it'd be longer, I know, right? But for instance, just take this student's diagram of the Jackson 5's I Want You Back. In this case, our conversation unexpectedly shifted to rhythm and meter when we turned to her transcription of the bass breakdown. So organically, we got to discuss, well, is the beat really here? Are you hearing it there? And does the bass really go, or is it bum-bum-bum, and which one is it, and how would you notate it? And very organically, this conversation drew on tools such as conducting, takadimi, solfege. So many of these moments. It was wonderful. I'm looking forward to repeating this assignment in the fall. I'm going to change a lot of things. One of them is to more carefully scaffold it over the course of the semester, and also collect data on student impressions, which I didn't do this first time. And so I'll close by saying, yes, this certainly invites challenges, particularly those relating to scalability and the sometimes unwieldy nature of allowing students to choose their own repertoire. But I am convinced that the challenges are worth the returns. This activity is tailor-made to engage students. It does not require standard notation. It works well in introductory courses, and it mirrors practical contexts in which our students may find themselves. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. We have time for questions.
Thank you, I love this. I was also wondering who was going to be the first theory paper mentioning the Beatles documentary, so here it is. I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about how you think the scaffolding might go, because there's a lot of skills that these students have already acquired to be able to do this, so how do you see the process of having a shorter, simpler version of this and building up to the final?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, so in Jenny Snodgrass's 2020 book, there's a similar, she does a similar assignment in a Theory 2 course, and it's an analysis project where it goes over the course of the whole semester. And you know, they start with just basic tasks like, I don't know, identifying all of the markings in the score, you know, and then proceeding, and then sort of adding a layer of information each time. And so I think I could really easily do something like that with this assignment. So for instance, you know, rather than having them put together the whole thing at the end of the semester, maybe they start with the form and phrase structure. And, you know, the first step is for them to just figure that out and to map it out. And then, I mean, ideally, we could have a series of conversations. Again, there's a time issue, of course, but they could not only practice doing the analysis, the oral analysis, but practice the conversing part of it, you know, over several stages. So yeah, I think I would do something like that, and I think it would fit. Thank you.
Thanks for a great paper.
Thank you.
I was thinking, so I love that you use this with early students in their freshman year, you say? So I was thinking kind of about this idea of scaffolding. It would be wonderful to see how they can do more over the course of their entire degree and kind of compare, like make sure, you know, like establish a portfolio or something like that where they see like, oh my gosh, look what my limitations were at the beginning and look at how far I've come, because sometimes that process is so incremental that students don't even notice. And I'm like, oh, do you know how hard I make this easy for you? Do you know how hard it is for me to do that? Yeah, so I just wonder what thoughts you have on that.
I think that, yeah, I mean, it's a great thought. And I mean, I love the idea. And I think just the next step would be really planning that out and seeing, you know, how that could be how that could work over the course of however many, whether it's just the first year. We only have our students are only required to take 2 semesters of, or I should say this, all degrees are only required to take 2 semesters of theory and musicianship, and then there are some degrees that take a few more. So maybe doing it over the first year at least, so that everyone sort of go through this experience. Yeah, I mean, it's a great, let's talk more after. I'd love to hear your ideas about that.
Thanks, this is great. Can you say more about like how that 5-minute meeting goes? Like, do you ask them questions? Do they have to just kind of like lead you through? And how do you like set that up for their expectations in the assignment or whatever for who's gonna lead and yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so I didn't put all of the assignment guidelines up there, but yeah, there is something in there that says, that tells the students that it'll start with them, we have they come in with the recording, and they're in the driver's seat, you know, so they start playing it, and we're listening to it, and then they begin by, you know, stopping it and when they want to, and sort of talking about the music and demonstrating a part and singing it on solfege and sort of doing their thing. And then at a certain point, inevitably, I sort of interrupt and ask them questions and say, oh, well, what about, you know, this part? And so it starts with them, and then it becomes a conversation. And they knew that in advance. And again, the challenge was just the time constraints. Some of them, when there was enough time for us to go over, we did. Yeah.
So I saw that they have this explanation moment and conversing with you. Have you tried, or is there any ideas about making them also explain the guided tour to their peers? Because I think they would also learn a lot from seeing all this repertoire. But I understand that it would take a lot of class time. And I tried similar things, it's a lot of time. Yeah.
Right, but that could be a good solution to, you know, the need to get them practice. It's like anything I want them to do, they need enough practice doing that thing. So if it's talking about music in this way, then yeah, I think that could be an in-class activity that would, I mean, it would take less of my time than it would to meet with each student, and it would give them practice doing that kind of conversing. I think I always find that the challenge with that is wanting to be there observing sort of all of the groups at once, and sort of, you know, inevitably not being able to do that. But I do think that would be a great solution to this issue.
All right, let's thank Andrew. Our next presenter is Sara Bakker, who is an associate professor of music at Utah State University. Her pedagogy research focuses on practical ways the scholarship of teaching and learning impacts the music theory classroom. She's certified in online teaching by the Association of College and University Educators, is a textbook reviewer for Oxford and Routledge, and an editor for Engaging Students. Reminds me of that South Park episode that you just kind of, yes, I agree, and then things happen. Her paper today is Diversifying Form Pedagogy. So let's welcome Sara Bakker.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to start by saying I'm really not used to doing conferences anymore, and I've always wanted to give a paper that is not a red paper. So this is me experimenting in like re-entering the world and trying a new format, because that's just how we roll. So I hope it doesn't come across as kind of condescending, because it is kind of like the way I teach, like kind of with notes and slides, and I just hope that I don't switch mentally. So just let me know if that's happening. Calls to update and expand music theory curricula are well established and stem from both within the field and without. To name just a few influential ones, there was Michael Tenzer's 2016 book, Analytical Studies in World Music, the College Music Society's 2014 Manifesto for Progressive Change in the Undergraduate Preparation of Music Majors, Cora Palfi and Eric Gilson's 2018 article on the hidden curriculum, and more recently, of course, Phil Ewell's 2019 plenary session address, subsequent article, and blog posts. Such calls as these have focused on the need to update three main areas of our teaching: the diversity of composers, especially across race and gender lines, the breadth of repertoire that we teach, and the breadth of theoretical approaches that we teach. While I believe that many teachers of music theory want to address our collective concerns about minoritized people, music, and music theories, significant barriers to change remain. Just a few of such barriers include the limitations imposed by existing textbooks, the significant work of developing new materials, the expertise and support necessary to teach things we may not have been taught ourselves in music theory classes, and beyond. But let's suppose we did agree that decentering, contextualizing, or at least reconsidering the role of Western art music is important to our teaching. How can that inform our teaching of a topic like form, where we have such studied, detailed, and insightful analytical techniques for things like sonata form, binary and ternary forms, and fugue? One approach would be to change out some of our examples, maybe replace a few Mozart sonata form pieces with pieces by Chevalier Saint-Georges or Rebecca Clark. This would address number one. While changing the balance of voices is important, we need to be wary of just stopping there. The potential for transformative change lies in addressing numbers 2 and 3. If we simply choose new examples and choose them based on how well they fit in our current topics, we are inadvertently reinforcing the framework we have developed for conventional examples, and we have no need to fundamentally rethink what is music, what is appropriate for music majors to study, and what does one really need to know about music and form to be an educated musician. In this talk, I outline what it might look like if we were to radically reframe our teaching. Okay. Sorry, our teaching, I've turned it off. Okay. Radically reframe our teaching of form, an area that has received remarkably little attention among recent calls for updating. I will outline a framework for teaching formal analysis that can accommodate a very broad range of music, yet is also relatively simple to implement. It's one that I have taught my form and analysis class using for the past 5 years. I will use that framework to end my experience to suggest ways that form instruction can become proactively more inclusive and pedagogically sound. Sorry, I'm just getting all set up here. All right, so the term that I'm using for this technique is called flexible form. And it's a framework for teaching form that can, again, accommodate a broad range of music, is relatively simple to implement, and can be pedagogically sound, and I'll kind of outline what I mean by that. How it works is by focusing on the highest levels of form, so not looking at sonata form as like all of these little details, but really kind of zooming way out and seeing that there is an A, a B, and an A prime, that kind of thing. So really, really high level. And I know there's definitely something we lose in doing that, but there's also something we gain. So we're focusing on big picture A's, B's, and C's. And we're kind of inviting students to both work from scores and from recordings and look and listen, so both of those things, for things like unity, variety, contrast, and kind of thinking about detailed, how does that happen in this piece? How is this an A prime, kind of like we were talking about, versus an A? How is that different? So here are the categories that I have come up with. The one-part forms, These are essentially, if you just look to the letter representation, those are all essentially just high-level A forms, repetitions of essentially something structurally the same every time. But then if you see there are little A primes and double primes and triple primes, those are all the variations, right? So if you imagine any of these pieces, strophic songs, hymns, those are maybe the least varied across time. You know, there are different words, essentially. But as we get into, let's say, a blues song, the words are changing, but often there's also instrumental changes. You might have students listen for what is different in this verse versus the first verse. Okay, so how does that change over time? And how does that impact our discussion of form? That's often, those changes in texture and instrumentation are things that often just kind of go under the radar. And the problem with that is that is a really structural part. That is the identity of jazz, for example. Similarly, if we look at theme and variations, so very similar structure to jazz in this kind of framework, but the idea there is that, again, we're looking at things, how they are constant, how they are changing. And I would say when we're talking about one-part forms in my class, although we are recognizing that similarity, that high-level similarity, we're really keying in to what is different. Okay, so even though we're kind of balancing these two contrasts, these two opposites, I think it's really important that you don't just say, oh, these are just all A's. These are just, don't ever say, these are just anything. That is a terrible, terrible way to teach. But really focusing on when we are noticing things that are similar, focusing in on those differences. Okay, then the next category, you can probably guess, two-part forms. So this is where I would say most of our form time typically falls. So our binary forms, our ternary, departure, return forms, da capo aria, if you separate that out, sonata and concerto forms, popular songs, again, thinking really of the early like 1950s, 60s stuff where it's really just verse and chorus, just A and B kind of alternations, 32-bar song, and potentially fugue. And what I have here, I'm really not really sure what to do with fugue. I think this is a perennial problem. And so what I'm thinking of here is that A sections include the subject. B sections do not, okay? In my next slide, you'll see that I've also put it potentially with a question mark in the multi-part forms, just because do you want to compare episodes across? Are you going to say that the first episode is the same functionally, both B's, or is one a B and one a C? So that's kind of the issue that I'm dealing with there. The reason that I think it's really helpful to put these into a category together, obviously because there are similarities between them, but also if you look at the last category, which is genre considerations, that is something that surprised me that my students were not getting in my discussions of form previously. So they would talk about, oh my goodness, so many anachronistic things, like a vocal theme and variations. And you know, I understand where you're coming from, and that's a valid thing to say, but that's not the category that we would typically put it in. Maybe that's another discussion we should be having. So I wanted to make sure that I was also tracking, you know, typically where you would find this kind of thing. And then the last section, or the last type of form, the category, is what I call multi-part forms. Again, I don't want to separate three-part form, like the five-part rondo versus the seven-part rondo, just put them in one giant category. And again, you can see fugue is potentially here, but then also dealing with rondos, sonata rondos, and then popular song. But again, the ones that are happening on the radio nowadays involve lots of different sections. And I think that formal complexity is not something that we really address well in our form teaching, if we cover form in popular music at all. Okay, so one thing I actually realized I haven't mentioned is that with all of these multi-part forms, the two-part forms or the one-part forms, I am not considering introductions to be a section or any kind of linking sections or any kind of outro, conclusion, coda. I'm just saying those can be present in any form, and you can have them or not, and they don't change what category we would put them in. Okay, so now on to teaching with this, and this is really kind of drawing on my own preparation over the past 5 years. So as a teacher, I find it very helpful to focus on learning objectives, and I start with a backward design, which means that I think about what I want my students to come away with at the end of the class, and then I kind of work from there to the future, or to the present and hopefully a future. So this is my learning, this is kind of like the general overview of the class. In this is a form and analysis course that focuses on structural elements of music as they unfold in time. In it, you will learn to apply specific form labels, sonata, rondo, variations, ternary, strophic, verse, chorus, as well as more generic terms, sections, themes, patterns, motives, and lots of things could go into this, open, closed, all of that, to music in audio or visual formats. You will learn to describe music as a balance of familiar and novel elements and model it using timelines. You will also learn to generate original music that follows specific presets. So I have students composing in each of these forms. I use this framework to engage students' local student interests. So where I teach in northern Utah, there is a really strong LDS population. And so one of the things that I've really appreciated about this is that I can bring in or let them bring in LDS hymns and music that is familiar and meaningful to them. And we can say, oh, yes, that is a valid music. Yes, we can talk about how that is structured. And if you wanted to write something that sounded like that, what are the kinds of things you'd need to think about? Okay, so I feel like to the extent that we have trouble choosing what music to bring in to the classroom and what to leave out, that is an issue of knowing what our learning objectives are. So I mentioned that this is kind of my general overview of the course, and that I have specific learning goals that I'd like to go to next. So this is from my syllabus with my memoji before I had a haircut. Okay, so the first one, these are all kind of based on the IDEA course evaluations. That's kind of a standard thing. I don't know if your institution has it, but I don't have a lot of flexibility with what's in bold and green highlighting. And so I keep that because that's what students will see on their course evaluations, but then I flesh out how it applies to this class. So essential, gaining factual knowledge. You will describe music in a variety of styles using both generic organizational terms and commonly used Western form terminology. Essential number 2, learning to apply course materials. You will identify key features of 1, 2, and multi-part forms in a variety of musical styles. You will use analytical terminology to describe the formal organization of novel pieces from scores or recordings. You will create timelines that represent pieces using audio timeliner or paper. You will generate original music that follows specific formal precepts. Okay, and then the last one, gaining a broader understanding and appreciation of intellectual cultural activity. You will compare a variety of possible realizations of a given formal structure. So again, that comparing within the A's, comparing A and B type forms, framing each as a balance of familiar and novel elements. You will evaluate the prescriptive, descriptive, and structuring roles of form in the creative process. Okay. What is my next slide? Okay. So I wanted just to point out a few things about these learning objectives. They are very Bloom-centered, Bloom verb-centered, and they're also very student-doing-centered. So it's not like I will teach because we know there is a disconnect between what we teach and what students can do after we've taught what we know they should definitely know. Okay, so kind of in the structure of the form of how I teach my form class, I've taught it in using 5 units. Okay, you can probably you can probably guess that 3 of them are going to be these different form types. The first section that I typically teach is just a Unit 1, broad discussions kind of about what is all the terminology, basically, especially the generic terminology. And we don't connect it to a lot of pieces. So just kind of like getting some of those terms out, students might bring in terms that they know, like what does this mean? I've heard people saying that. So can we make a big list on the board and kind of go from there? We also talk about analysis prompts. So like basically when you are doing analysis, how do you know that you're doing it right? Okay, so especially from a form perspective, you want to be thinking about, in my opinion, how many sections does it have? Like what is similar across those sections? What is different within the sections? All of that kind of stuff. So giving them a structure to know, like, kind of like a checklist to get started. And there will always be more that they will find later. Okay, so this is kind of what that looks like. So as they're working through a piece in this initial unit, and it's designed, that initial unit is maybe a week and a half or so, it's designed to be messy, and it's really uncomfortable, but I think it's really pedagogically valuable. I try not to give them like all the same kind of piece. I try not to be really consistent. I try to be messy because that's how they experience music in the world. And I want them to, again, take away these things, not feel comfortable with them in class, especially in the first week of class. Like, that is not a reasonable goal. So this is kind of set up like, the big idea is, how is this piece structured over time? And they should be thinking about, is this a piece that kind of falls into the category of subtle changes over time? So thinking about how it unfolds as you listen. Or is it one that's really about big contrasts? And those are just two fundamentally, for me, different categories, different ways of experiencing time through music. And then once we've kind of decided that, then there are kind of follow-up questions on the one-part forms. How is that unity kept interesting, right? Because if we have that A section all the time, something is going to change to make it interesting, whether that's the words and we're hearing like a narrative change or narrative develop, whether that's variations in the instrumentation, the texture, the volume, lots of different things, key changes. And then on the other side, how is that contrast made coherent? Again, we can't just have A, B, C, D, E. We can't just have new things all the time. That's a little bit overwhelming. And I think that a lot of composers, whether they are trained or not, whether just kind of intuitive, they have a sense that they need to kind of constrain that and make them go together in some way. So how is that happening in whatever music you're listening to or looking at? And then the last three kind of categories are kind of apply to both sections. So I asked them to describe the sections within the piece, what kind of structures those use. So again, if you're thinking about, let's say, a theme and variations piece, often the theme has its own structure. And at this point, we wouldn't have talked through any of that. So thinking about that kind of thing can fall into that first category. What are the substructures that are happening? You can talk about phrases there and how those kind of build up to larger things. And if you have questions about important cadences, that medial caesura, it doesn't have to die. It can just have a bit more of a context. The next one, how does this piece compare to other pieces we've studied? So again, this doesn't really work in that initial unit, but again, thinking over time, this is something that I want them to be thinking about. How are A-B pieces with two big contrasts or one contrast between two sections, how is that different from pieces that don't really have a big contrast? What other pieces does it remind you of? And that has been a really fun question for them. They bring in things that I am not expecting and not prepared, and Spotify has been wonderful so that we can just kind of pull it up and listen in class. And then finally, what would you bring out if you were performing this piece? So again, you can draw on this or not, but I know that my students come from a performing background, and that's a way that I can engage that component of their musicianship. Okay. So this is the main purpose of my first unit, and then my units 2, 3, and 4 are jumping into one-part forms, two-part forms, and multi-part forms. The way that I've typically structured those is that the first unit is pretty short. 2 is, so that the one-part form unit is a little bit longer, maybe 2 to 3 weeks. The multi-part forms, or sorry, two-part forms, maybe it would be helpful to see this. Because this is a big category, and I want to make sure that we have enough time. A lot of our music, of all kinds, falls into this category. So I do give it more time structurally in the class. And then this is kind of our last of the kind of structural units. But I think what's really important in this class is that I have a 5th unit, which is a kind of like go back to the chaos of Unit 1, where we bring in, that is me and also students, bring in random pieces and talk about them together. And of course, that unit is the most fun and most rewarding in some ways, but also the most challenging and difficult to kind of prepare for. One of the ways that I've really enjoyed working with that is having students work into groups so that we don't take all the class time to go through every single example, but they're working with peers and having those discussions. And as I walk around, I'm like drawn to tears, like with how proud I am of the progress that they're making and the talks that they're having. Okay. So now I'm just going to read my conclusion. The flexible form approach proactively makes space for music by women and people of color, but I believe its more valuable contribution is in forcing us to contend with the biases inherent in our current curricula. For me, it has put into perspective how much I used to prioritize sonata form and the white repertoire that goes with it. It has also helped me clarify for students deeper meanings of what form study entails, focusing on a consistent analytical perspective. It has also helped me navigate the significant shift in a somewhat incremental way, updating different things over time and integrating them into a coherent framework as I can. We have heard so many wonderful ideas about what to add to our curricula at this conference, and what we teach is never neutral. We need to be just as judicious with what we put in as what we leave out, knowing that it will always be a balance and will always have consequences. I hope that this paper has helped you notice the power of our incumbent formal categories and has given you some ideas about how to approach your own teaching of form. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara. We have time for questions.
There's a reason you're having trouble with fugue. It's a process and not a form.
Right? No, I know.
Okay, it is a
I
process.
know.
And if you can put in there with it, continuous variation is generally a process more than a form. Many of the other contrapuntally based, particularly early Baroque or coming from the Renaissance genres, are of that type, but there are 20th century ones that are like that too.
True.
So if you think about it as a process that can sometimes have a superstructure that is a form, like a big ABA, which does happen in some fugues, but not by any stretch
right,
all.
right.
And in some continuous variations where the change to the other mode may make a big superstructure. Anyway, that's one way to handle that, is it's just doing something different. It's not intended to be following a form. It's
much
rather
less a container style vision. I agree.
Exactly.
It would be
it's
interesting,
much
though, to
more
think about whether
contemporary.
it would be helpful to have a section, like maybe a unit or something like that, on process forms, because I'm thinking, I'm a Ligeti scholar, and so Ligeti loves processes and how they fall apart over time, and I think that would be a compelling course,
And
too,
one
but
way-
maybe a unit.
One way to handle it within your units is to give it as a counterexample. You know, so if you have a unit where these pieces are working this way,
Right.
here's another way
How-
to handle that is working contrary to, you know, and that will maybe allow you to bring in some other types of music that don't do sectional forms from other places, other kinds of
Sure,
repertoire,
sure.
where they can serve as here's another way to do it, that's another conceptual process that makes a structure that's logical, coherent, and identifiable, but it's not a sectional form.
I love it. I love it. I was thinking, again, thinking back to where my experience lies, Ligeti has a lot of repetition in its piece, but again, because they're processes that are like disintegrating, thinking about how that's different from an A section or an A-based piece would help students realize that even though there's a lot of repetition, it doesn't mean it's all A. You can't just listen to the surface and say, I know the structure.
Developing variation forces,
Yeah, I love it. Thank you.
Thank you. I really like how you took like all these wide variety of forms and put them under just a few umbrella terms. So that was nice. I wondered if you use just your own examples and articulations and student examples, or if you supplement with a textbook too.
I don't use a textbook. I'm really, really incompetent at teaching from a textbook in a way that is actually embarrassing. So I prefer to teach from scores and recordings, and I like, especially for a form class, that it is just naturally very open-ended. And again, that it's possible for students to bring in whatever they're listening to or things that they've heard about, and also to write things, and again, for that to be very open-ended. So for me, it's really important that it be open-ended, and so that is how I self-justify not teaching from a textbook.
Yeah, kind of along those lines, I've been thinking a lot about, so teaching like popular music alongside classical music, and you know, and you're kind of, this really interesting kind of breakdown you have has it all kind of together, which I imagine presents like opportunities and challenges, like, you know, the confusion between piece and song that we hear a lot from students, or yeah, this idea that like a vocal theme and variations is the same as strophic form, you know, that they're genre specific kind of. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of that, that decision as opposed to saying having like a classical kind of way of going through form and then a popular way of moving through form kind of.
Yeah. So I will say it is intentional, and again, it is very messy. But I feel like, kind of like you alluded to, that is a place of really fruitful potential for growth for students. Partly just to realize that, you know, there are things in common between music that is written 300 years ago and music that was written last year. That it kind of gets to something cognitive in listening, that listening process. But I also, I know what you're talking about with the challenges of like students misinterpreting how the categories work, essentially. And I do struggle, especially with this structure, with my students coming away from like, oh yeah, that's just a one-part form, and like no one else knows what that means. I mean, if they had a conversation, they could definitely explain it, and I'm confident that they would be articulate. But that having kind of developed our own form terminology, I think is a bit of a challenge. I will also say that I like that that kind of classical music and popular music are intermingled. I don't want to separate them, and that's a really intentional kind of pedagogical thing, that I want to kind of put them on equal footing, even if you don't like a certain piece or a certain style or a certain genre or whatever, just to say that they both have structure. We can talk about the structure. They fit into categories. We've seen things like this. It's worth listening to in a structured way, intentional way.
Sara, do you have anything built in to account for climax?
Oh, no, and that is brilliant.
I'm asking that because a lot of the popular forms,
right.
What guides their development is the search or delay for climax. You know, like the dense scores and that kind of thing.
Right.
So I think that's kind of something.
I think that's a great idea. So just off the top of my head, I would like to think about how I would integrate that into, again, all the different kinds of forms, thinking about what structures the climax. Yeah, I love it.
Great.
Love it.
Thanks, Sara. I enjoyed your talk. It is really refreshing to see ways to put, you know, popular musics and other musics together under an umbrella. I'm troubled by the word part. And you were just talking about having students have unusual terms, but it felt funny to look at a slide that says two-part form, and one of the choices is ABA ternary. There. So ternary, you know, that's two parts.
Because that means three, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So I'm just wondering if you could change part to, you know, two element or two theme or two something, you know, just not part. Because they'll learn in some other school or grad school or something if they see a little ternary piece and they say, oh, this is two part, you know.
Definitely
I don't know, you
not.
might just think about
no,
that.
I appreciate that. I struggled with that a lot. I worried about things like calling it a two-section form or the kind of confluence of like part writing and how, I mean, we don't teach a lot of part writing, but even just knowing that that word goes with something else, I think it's a good, what did you suggest? Element? Yeah. Yeah. It's well placed. Yeah, thank you.
All right, let's thank Sara Bakker. Thank you. Our next paper has two authors. Chandler Blount is a PhD student in music theory at Florida State University, where he studies correspondences between poetic and musical structure in 19th century leader. He's an avid consumer of all things Star Trek and is currently on his 21st run through Deep Space Nine. Chandler cannot be here today, but that's probably watch his 22nd run. And but we do have Jordan Lenchitz, who is a PhD candidate in music theory at Florida State University as well. His research interests include musics as sounds, extended just intonation, computational music cognition, postmodern music pedagogy, and the music of Stephen Sondheim. In his spare time, Jordan enjoys walking and creating experimental sound and video art. And their paper today is called An Amicable Divorce, Decoupling Concepts in Repertoire in the Music Theory Classroom. So let's welcome Jordan and Chandler virtually.
Little.
Thanks very much. And as mentioned, Chandler is unable to be here, but I'm happy to be representing the both of us for you today. The music theory classroom has long enabled an unhappy marriage of general concepts to specific repertoire. As many recent scholars have noted, the music theory core curriculum has historically emphasized Western European compositions to the exclusion of other style periods and genres, creating a hidden curriculum that lifts the so-called common practice period above all others. And yet, decentering this repertoire creates a pedagogical problem for many contemporary approaches, encapsulated by Justin London's borrowing of the concept of overfitting from mathematical modeling. Namely, our definitions for basic music theoretical concepts often correspond too closely to the parameters of a narrow selection of works from the 18th and 19th centuries. This constructs an artificial style specificity that can in practice limit our students' ability to engage meaningfully with other music. In this paper, we present a case study in broadening our presentations of concepts so that they can encompass a wider variety of musical styles, focusing particularly on what in Poundy Burstein's parlance is a slippery topic that often troubles students, the cadence. In a variety of 21st century textbooks following differing pedagogical approaches and targeting different audiences, cadences are defined in terms of harmonic patterns. In Koskapane and Almain's tonal harmony, for instance, the term cadence means a harmonic goal, specifically the chords used at the goal. Bell and Chicorel in Music Theory for Musical Theater define a cadence as a progression of two or more chords at the end of a musical phrase. And Geyer, in his recent Music Theory in Mind and Culture, posits that a cadence is a voice-leading formula that signals the closure of a voice-leading process. These strong focuses on harmony are admittedly unsurprising, as harmony-centered heuristics can be an excellent predictor of phrase endings in many styles, especially classical music. Indeed, harmony-centered approaches have even been proven successful for specific repertoires in purely algorithmic contexts. By framing arrival points in terms of local harmonic successions combined with melodic patterns, Bigot et al. In 2018 produced a computer classifier that was able to predict perfect authentic cadences in Bach keyboard fugues and Haydn string quartet expositions correctly more than 75% of the time and with a low false positive rate. But once we consider styles that do not use the same harmonic norms as Bach to Brahms, such as folk, rock, blues, jazz, and post-millennial pop, to name just a few, parameters other than harmony increasingly complicate the issue. Such harmony-centric framings of cadence are by no means a recent phenomenon. In the 1987 inaugural issue of the Journal of Music Theory Pedagogy that we heard a little bit about at the banquet on Thursday, Anne Blaumbach examined 81 pedagogical resources from that time. She found that 70% of their cadence definitions included harmony and or chord progression, 41% of definitions referred to rhythm, 39% included a comparison to language and or punctuation, and 54% invoked the end of a phrase. If we now survey the 7 textbooks that account for virtually the entire market in the United States in the 21st century, or roughly 96% as of 2020, cited by Phil Ewell, we find that some things have not changed very much. 86% of their definitions include harmony or chord progression, 43% reference rhythm or meter, and 71% make that comparison to language or punctuation. 86% invoke the end of a phrase. And for comparison to our framework, we'll note that 43% mention number of measures, while only 14% make mappings between text and form. Linking phrase and cadence together by framing their relationship using a linguistic metaphor like sentence, paragraph, or punctuation has evidently grown in popularity and prevalence over the past 35 years, but the core of cadence coverage has remained tremendously harmonic. And the context in which cadence is first defined further underscore this orientation, generally coming in chapters with titles along the lines of tonic and dominant, or harmonic progression, or alongside the first appearance of voice leading and four-part writing. In practice, these contexts for cadence see students' first exposure coming through writing and analyzing isolated forms of 1-5 and 5-1 in a sort of musical laboratory setting that is unlikely to capture their imagination. It also does not help matters that definitions of cadence are very often circular. A cadence is the end of a phrase, and a phrase is a unit that ends with a cadence. In the context of this circularity, Blount noted the intuitive nature of pedagogy on this topic, as it was most often presented in the 1980s. Teachers gave copious examples of musical events that they, through experience, had learned to label as phrases, ending in cadences, and by watching a teacher point out these phrases, students learned to identify phrases, and therefore cadences, on their own. Such intuitive approaches exemplify what King refers to as sage on a stage pedagogy, and is contrasted with guide on the side. Now, for some narrow slice of our students, their background, combined with intuition learned by example, may well carry them through. But more often than not, students come to us with some preconceived yet highly non-specific ideas of what constitutes a phrase or a cadence. This is another hereditary problem for music theory, as Blount has noted, and also Rothstein and Kaplan. Yet in combating these preconceived and non-specific notions of phrase and cadence, many pedagogies end up on the opposite extreme of overspecificity by overfitting to the repertoire of the common practice. We accordingly argue for an approach that falls in the middle of these two extremes and aligns more closely with guide on the side than sage on a stage, by presenting cadences specifically enough to yield insight into repertoire without tying them down to anyone's style, nor relying on imitation as a primary means of transmission. Before presenting our more holistic and inclusive approach to cadence pedagogy, it is worth talking about what a cadence is. This might seem like a basic enough topic, especially for a room full of music theorists, but since ultimately a cadence is an interpretive phenomenon, its exact nature is still subject to debate, with far too many facets to cover fully in an undergraduate classroom. To give a very non-exhaustive selection of examples from the field, some writers like Yurdigan and Martin and Pinot de Laurier focus on patterns, characteristic of cadences in historical Western European styles that, along with closures in rhythm and meter, typically indicate the end of formal units. Others, like Sears, focus on the cognitive mechanisms involved with cadential perception, and specifically how experts and non-experts alike may perceive cadences differently. Still others, reacting to a move toward more style-specific definitions of form, focus on cadential patterns as form defining in popular genres. Because our method aims to scaffold style-specific discussions of what a cadence is on top of a broader framework designed to capture a range of possibilities for closure, we will eschew the style-specific for now and define a cadence as follows, and then circle back to this with our framework. A cadence is an emergent sense of closure that results from the simultaneous completion of several different musical streams, usually the metrical, melodic, harmonic, and if present, textual. The first three streams here are highly conventional to music theory pedagogy. As our survey of textbooks today showed, many textbooks present definitions that skew heavily toward the harmonic, if not explicitly, then at least implicitly by packaging cadence in discussions of voice leading, although many do make at least some mention of metrical and melodic closure as well, however brief these may be. Our fourth stream here may at first seem like a misfit, but as we will soon show, it is more of a dark horse. Except in highly irregular examples, composers and songwriters tend to treat the endings of lines, couplets, and stanzas as formal boundaries, meaning that texted examples can serve like training wheels for our students who are new to learning about musical form. Students under this method are provided some background information about how musical closure may happen within each of these categories, as represented in the handout projected on the screen. We'd like to note that this approach is inspired by Victoria Malloway's 2011 multi-parametric approach to comparing popular music covers in the undergraduate classroom. As before, many of the usual suspects make an appearance in our framework. For example, melodically, students consider the goal tones of fluent descents to be potential candidates for cadence placement. Similarly, they should look for melodic repetition, as in a parallel period encapsulated here in Roman numeral 1d, and consider periodicity in excerpts that they think contain more than one phrase, encapsulated in Roman numeral 2c. In our eyes, the strength of this method is that it does not privilege any single feature as the cadence-defining feature, nor does it suggest a priori answers to the student. Instead, it provides a heuristic for weighing different potential interpretations of an excerpt against each other. Students using this method are not encouraged to necessarily find the cadence or the phrase structure, but instead identify several different possibilities and then discuss the comparative merits of each. One potential drawback of this method is that certain logical dependencies specific to classical repertoire are not preserved. For example, melodic repetition can signal a new phrase, but not if what's being repeated is a shorter subphrase, as in a sentence structure. Essentially, melodic repetition tends to work as a strongly predictive feature except when it conflicts with periodicity. However, this is a point that an instructor can clarify during in-class discussion, tying it to repertoire specificity, which the broader framework seeks to avoid. And finally, our framework here is a starting point that includes a few ways to narrow down a cadence without solely relying on harmony. If you have any suggestions for further categories, we would love for you to mention them during the Q&A after our presentation. In an ideal analytical activity under this framework, students split into small groups. First, they listen to the excerpt several times and identify a variety of cadence points. This could be prompted with a simple problem, such as how many cadences are in this excerpt? In solving this problem, students should produce multiple different potential answers and debate amongst themselves the relative strengths of each interpretation. After this period of discussion and debate, each group is then sharing the interpretation they settle on and explaining why they chose it over others. Other groups are then actively encouraged to concur or disagree as appropriate. But this is not a stopping point, because we are not looking for the answer or the answer by committee. The instructor here ideally pushes further by playing devil's advocate for interpretations that were not chosen and asking students to argue against or for them. It bears repeating that the goal is not to find any one answer in particular, but rather for students to understand the metrical, melodic, harmonic, and textual factors involved in creating a sense of either a phrase continuing or ending. And depending on taste, an instructor may choose not to open with the framework, but instead to prompt students with a different problem that allows them to build it for themselves. Something along the lines of, how does a piece of music signal that it is ending, or that it's about to end, or perhaps, what kind of things do you expect to happen at the end of a piece or section? Today, we will demonstrate this method briefly using two contrasting examples. The first, Mr. Goldstone, is from the Broadway musical Gypsy, a Musical Fable by Julie Stein, Stephen Sondheim, and Arthur Lawrence. Here is Ethel Merman, where we will consider just the first page, giving more than enough for a very initial lesson with our undergrads on cadence.
Have an egg roll, Mr. Goldstone. Have a napkin, have a chopstick, have a chair. Have a spare rib, Mr. Goldstone. Any spare rib that I can spare, I'd be glad to share.
Though this may seem like a somewhat advanced example because of the chromatic harmonies present, such as 5, a flat 5 in measures 7 and 8, or the modulation in measures 14 to 16, it is relatively accessible for students when we emphasize the other non-harmonic parameters present in the framework. For example, if we just go off of the hypermeter, this yields potential cadence points at measures 4, 8, 12, and 16, asterisked here. Of these 4 possibilities, only 2 manifest most of the features identified in our framework, measure 8 and measure 16. A potential cadence at measure 4 is probably the least convincing option. There is no harmonic arrival here, since in order to arrive somewhere, the harmony would have to go somewhere from where it was, which it did not. Students may question whether the tide-dotted quarters on the word Goldstone constitute some kind of melodic repose, or perhaps the goal of a long-term trajectory. And they may similarly react to the figure in measure 12, also on Goldstone. However, compared to 8 and 16, these are clearly far less stable as points of repose. The melody does not come to a stop at 4 nor 12, nor does the rhyming of Goldstone with itself here provide the same level of satisfaction as the rhyming of chair with share. Finally, the only changes in figuration, in the form of a brief stoppage of the bass line paired with filigree in the winds, happen at 8 and 16. As before, the point of this exercise is not to definitively prove that the only cadences in this excerpt are at 8 and 16, or if you really do not like the harmony in measure 8 as a cadential one, then just 16. But instead, for students to investigate why and how some points of closure might sound more definitive than others. A checklisted version of the framework that might result from such in-class group discussion might look something like this. If the instructor wished to push further into this example later in the curriculum, when students have studied chromatic harmony and advanced form, they might highlight the 5 of flat 5 in measures 7 and 8 as a potential cadence point within this style. And the thematic design of this excerpt also could be returned to later on. If 8 is treated as a cadence, then we can read this opening page as an example of Kaplan's hybrid 1, with an antecedent from measures 1 to 8 and continuation from 9 to 16. Our second and final example, Little Boxes, was originally written and performed by folk protest singer Malvina Reynolds in 1962, though you may be more familiar with Pete Singer's 1963 cover. Let's listen to the original.
Little boxes on the hillside, little boxes made of ticky-tacky, little boxes on the hillside, little boxes all the same. There's a pink one and a green one, and a blue one and a yellow one, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky, and they all look just the same.
As in Mr. Goldstone, following just the hypermeter gives us 4 potential cadence points, measures 4, 8, 12, and 16 with the asterisks. And once again, some of these options present themselves as much stronger cadence candidates than the others. We will focus first on rhyme scheme here, since this is a clearly accessible analytical route that highlights the comparative strength of the resting points in 8 and 16. The sole rhyme in this excerpt is between all the same in 7 and 8 and just the same in 15 and 16, lending these measures a sense of textual closure that simply does not happen anywhere else. Similarly, both 8 and 16 represent the goal points of long-term descents in the melody, from C to G and C to F, respectively. On the other hand, measures 4 and 8 represent slightly weaker points of repose. If students were trying to argue for closure there, they might point to the return to a harmony from a departure to the subdominant in the previous measure that creates a sense of temporarily sounding at rest harmonically. But at the same time, they will also notice that the melody is still very much in motion in measures 4 and 8. Though both measures contain a brief descent from A down to F, this F is an octave higher than where we started in the original register. Resolution to an original register isn't necessarily a requirement for cadence, but it is something that, in a comparative sense, can make one potential cadence point sound more definitive than another in a comparative analysis. Before we wrap up, we should emphasize that this is a day 1 model. That is, a way of leading students through their very first encounter with cadence on a conceptual level. Later, students probably will encounter trickier situations like phrase expansions. And whether these manifest as internal through evasion, external through extension, or otherwise, our framework should ultimately make such situations easier to approach because multi-parametric thinking encourages students to analyze their own expectations for where and why a cadence might occur. In the case of one more time technique repetition, for instance, students are equipped to deconstruct why they would expect a cadence in a certain measure and then compare how such expectation is reestablished and confirmed some measures later. Our model can serve as a starting point for spiraling throughout the curriculum because the instructor can layer style-specific parameters on top of the broader concept presented previously as new and different repertoires are encountered. Here, spiraling helps to avoid the pitfall of cramming in more musical styles at the cost of depth, and without generalizing classical harmonic norms onto music that doesn't necessarily follow them. In practice, notions of phrase and cadence, even in a post-tonal context some semesters later, could be approached by relying on a multi-parametric conception of closure already familiar to students, even as the harmonic syntax of the previous semesters drops off. And from a sequencing perspective, stressing the non-harmonic aspects of cadence allows for the instructor to first introduce the topic before classical harmony topics. Though some coverage of meter may be necessary, students, whether they realize it or not, can often figure out hypermeter by ear without much explanation. And failing this, they can always count measures. The possibility of introducing cadences before harmony topics speaks to the larger scale benefits of decoupling concepts and repertoire in the music theory classroom. In many conventional approaches, sequencing passes through fundamentals before getting to any bigger picture concepts, which results in students digesting abstract systems of labels with little or no notion of what they might later build to or why we are labeling things like that in the first place. Students who instead engage with broader concepts like closure and cadence before diving into the nuts and bolts are able to tell for themselves why they are learning those topics and how they can apply what they learn to the music all around them. It is precisely this application across repertoires from the very beginning of a broader conception that can get students invested in their own learning by encouraging them to follow their curiosity into the music they encounter outside our classrooms. Our case study today focused solely on cadences, but multi-parametric approaches designed to encourage interpretations in the plural could easily apply to coverage of timbre, texture, instrumentation, and form, just to name a few. Emphasizing the why and the how of analyzing music using broader frameworks conceptually helps students to understand music theory as interpretive description and not simply taxonomic labeling. Highlighting and embracing the gray areas that surround our concepts such as cadence as early as possible, without assuming a backdrop of black and white answers lurking somewhere within the music itself, gives our students the agency to peer behind the curtain of received wisdom. And in doing so, they get to experience firsthand what it is to interpret musical structures and communicate their interpretations to others. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
Thank you so much. You asked about other parameters or elements you might think about. I was struck by, with the two examples, you made a point of telling us who was performing them and then never spoke about that again. And I would get you to think about, especially when you're dealing with covers, which pretty much everything exists for most things, the role of performers, and especially then, because of that, tempo, dynamics, timbre, and so forth, and to what degree those really, help constitute these particular boundaries. And I'm also thinking a little bit about the work of John Rink, who has pushed back at the idea that we talk about fixed structures, cadences being part of them, and to what degree those are formed by performance, not something that is inherent in the work itself. Something to think about.
Thanks very much for that. And one example that comes super to mind specifically is near the end of the song Cabaret. In Cabaret, depending on director, there's a line, she was the happiest corpse I'd ever seen. And in a lot of earlier productions, the way that's usually sung is she was the happiest corpse I'd ever seen. But in the Sam Mendes production, it's the happiest corpse. So something kind of like specifically stress, prosody, and then tying that into performance, direction. But yeah, dynamics and performer specifically. Thank you very much for that.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciate your approach to just really broadening how we approach this thing. So my question is, you asked about, what could we add to your chart, which I really like. How might texture play into this as a way, all of your examples, the melodic and harmonic and even textual, those are still very line-oriented, right? Mm-hmm. And texture seems like it could, in some music, like experimental music or electronic music, show an end to a section, very clear ending to a section. If that doesn't feel cadential, then does that mean that maybe this concept could be expanded even more?
Thanks for that. Yeah. So in harmony, especially if we're getting to this before we talk too much about Roman numerals, the big thing that we're emphasizing is there a change? So like if we're thinking about departure or arrival, wherever we were has something kind of new and different happened. So with respect to texture, I think the easiest way to get into it would be, do we hear kind of a textural shift, like either right after this or shortly after, thinking about that kind of sectionally. But in terms of broadening the framework, I think that, yeah, a lot of these are really kind of linear in a sense. We're thinking about rhymes, which is sort of kind of like a linear phenomenon in the text, or melody stuff in a linear approach. And texture kind of has a more vertical orientation that's just not the harmonic. So if we were thinking about just like, not just sameness and difference, and I really love the invocation of unity in the previous talk, but kind of departure and arrival, then we could think about texture as like maybe in an accumulative sense, like, all right, we've kind of been building something, and then we either have a drop or we have kind of like a fake out and then a drop. And that's maybe a marker of a new section, so retrospectively we can say, right where a textural event happened, that was kind of a cadence element. But yeah, it's definitely, I think, worth thinking about kind of adding in maybe some more vertical things that aren't just harmony to kind of complement this horizontal approach.
Hi, thanks, Jordan. I just can't help but think of when it's an amicable divorce, I keep thinking of this consciously uncoupling that Gwyneth Paltrow and Chris White did like several years ago. They did end up getting divorced, so maybe it wasn't so amicable. At any rate, I'm wondering, this is a great project, I like it. I like the slide, especially when you showed essentially your definition of what a cadence might be.
Mm-hmm.
I think the word streaming was in there. And I'm wondering, if you touched on it just a little bit, but I'd like to maybe press you on it a little bit more. Like, what were some of the driving factors for you and Chandler? Say hi to him from me, please, also. In pursuing this project, because I can see a lot of great things happening with it. It is you're pulling away from what we have been handed down, you know, by all the names that you mentioned. We all know these folks. You know, what were some of the driving forces? Like, what were the reasons you were seeking to, or you know, expand on it a little bit if you could, because you did touch on it a little bit, but I'd like to know about, you know, your thought process and like why was this important for you to pursue?
For sure. So the biggest immediate thing we saw was that a lot of our students really were troubled by kind of the circularity. We said, well, cadence is the thing at the end of a phrase, and a phrase is the thing that ends with a cadence. So we were trying to say, all right, so if we're thinking about a cadence, it's a confluence of different things, and then once you have a cadence, you can say the phrase ends there. So it really arose from this specific problem that students kept saying is that, well, there's kind of this circle here, we're chasing our own tail. But a little more broadly than that, when we were starting just to like kind of swap up some of the examples that we're using in the classroom, we found that students in all sorts of styles, they would see kind of a 5 going to a 1, and they would say, oh, well, that's a cadence, because cadences were 5-1 so much when we first did them. And so we found that this kind of harmonic background that we had given them had led them into a false sense of, maybe not security, but just like, ooh, I can find the 5-1 or the 1-5 or the something 5, and that's the cadence. And so we saw students kind of zooming in and missing the bigger picture, especially when we were looking at kind of popular and more recent styles. So we were trying to think of a way just to de-emphasize the harmony, but also give them other things to look at, especially the text, which we're always trying to do in there, because just naturally working with English text, language that lots of our students are working with, by default just automatically kind of decenters like German Lied or Italian aria kind of repertoires, and you can still have a place for them, but when we're working with rhyme scheme and stuff, working with the languages that students bring into the classroom knowing the best already, that was another kind of consideration, is if we can elevate the text and we can elevate non-harmonic structures, then we can kind of let students rely on what they already know and not be building on things. But the biggest thing for us was that circularity of cadence and phrase kind of just being defined in terms of each other.
Thanks. So it's student-driven. That's excellent. I love that, and that's a great way to approach this. I wonder if I could just press you one last time and ask you: is there something outside of the classroom that you have noticed over the? Because we met, you know, I think right before I gave that talk in 2019, right? And we had a nice conversation. And this might have, you know, happened after that, I imagine, this project. That's fair enough. You know, like, 'cause I draw a lot of inspiration from people who are junior to me, you know, so grad students, even down to high school students who've reached out to me over these last few years. It's been pretty amazing. And I'm wondering, just from your perspective, outside of the classroom, have you noticed things going on? Well, you of course noticed things going on in the field, things that are changing. The ground is shifting under our feet. Can you maybe speak a little bit about the outside of the classroom, non-student-driven reasons to take on this project, and maybe link it to the larger stuff going on in the field? And I know that's a difficult question, but I'm just kind of interested to hear your thoughts about that.
Sure. So kind of the bigger, broader picture on this is kind of thinking about, just as we're redesigning curricula, specifically thinking about sequencing, because there's always this, oh, we would love to have time to talk about certain styles or certain repertoires or certain analytical techniques, but we just don't have the room in our 4 or 5 semester sequence for it. So we were starting to think, well, there's a lot of repetition built into the curriculum as it stands, so how might we be able to get some of these concepts like cadence or form or things earlier, so that way we can spend less time on them maybe in total, and then build up that room to like introduce other repertoires, other styles, and other techniques. So it was kind of born out of, in the outside of the classroom sense, as we're trying to rebuild curricula, rather than just kind of shuffle things around like locally, or maybe we'll do like this harmony thing after the form thing, moving as many big picture topics as we can to like the first semester of theory, to then free up space curricularly to have maybe entire semesters that don't talk about any classical music at all. So the sequencing angle there was why we're trying to think about, if we drag cadence a little earlier and then return to it with harmony and layer on style specificity, we can build up room in our curricula, maybe even whole semesters, to do things that aren't getting taught at all right now. Thank you.
That's all the time we have. Thank you for all the presenters. Appreciate it. And yeah, thank you, Jordan.